The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long shadows across the busy street corner where Raul's empanada cart stood. The smell of freshly baked empanadas filled the air, mingling with the sounds of honking cars and the chatter of pedestrians. Raul worked steadily, his hands a blur as he folded dough and filled it with spiced meat, cheese, and vegetables. The sizzling from his small stove was a comforting sound, a reminder that he was doing what he loved. His empanadas weren't just food, they were little pockets of care, wrapped and served with pride. Business had been slower than usual lately. Raul could feel the weight of every coin he counted at the end of each day. The cost of ingredients had risen, and fewer people seemed willing to spend money on street food. But he kept going, driven by the hope that each day would be better than the last. He had come too far to give up now. As he arranged a fresh batch of empanadas on the cart's warm surface, something caught his eye: a man standing across the street. He was thin, his clothes worn and stained, and his eyes were fixed on Raul's cart with a mix of hunger and hesitation. Raul recognized that look all too well. He'd seen it in the mirror years ago, when he first arrived in the city with nothing but empty pockets and dreams he could barely hold on to. The man took a tentative step forward but stopped, as if afraid to come closer. Raul's heart clenched. He wiped his hands on his apron and called out, "Hey, come here." The man glanced around, unsure if Raul was talking to him. When their eyes met, Raul nodded encouragingly. Slowly, the man approached, each step cautious, as though he expected to be turned away at any moment. "Hungry?" Raul asked, his voice gentle. The man nodded but quickly looked down, as if ashamed of the admission. "I don't have any money," the man murmured, his voice barely audible. Raul didn't hesitate. He reached for one of the freshly baked empanadas, still warm and golden brown. He wrapped it in a napkin and held it out. "Here, no charge." The man's eyes widened, and for a moment he didn't move. Then, with trembling hands, he accepted the empanada. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He took a careful bite, savoring the taste, but it was clear he was fighting the urge to devour it. Raul turned back to his cart, giving the man a moment of privacy to eat. He knew how hard it was to feel exposed like that, to be seen in your most vulnerable state. "What's your name?" Raul asked over his shoulder as he prepared another batch of empanadas. "Diego," came the reply, muffled slightly by a mouthful of food. "Nice to meet you, Diego. I'm Raul." For a few minutes, they exchanged no more words. Diego finished the empanada, his movements slow and deliberate, as if each bite was a lifeline. When he was done, he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "I don't know how to repay you." "You don't need to," Raul said firmly, placing another empanada on the cart's edge. "If you're still hungry, take another." Diego hesitated but eventually reached for it. The way he ate spoke volumes about how long he'd been without a proper meal. Raul couldn't help but feel a pang of empathy. He'd been there before, wondering where his next meal would come from, clinging to hope when there was little left. The evening rush began to pick up, and Raul had to focus on his customers, but as he served empanadas to hurried businessmen, tired mothers, and curious children, he kept an eye on Diego. When the rush subsided, Raul found Diego still lingering near the cart, as if unsure where to go next. "Do you have a place to stay tonight?" Raul asked, wiping his hands on a cloth. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truths. Diego shook his head. "I've been getting by," he said, his voice hollow. Raul understood what that meant. Sleeping on benches, in doorways, wherever he could find a moment's rest. Raul made a quick decision. "Come with me," he said. "I have a couch. It's not much, but it's better than out here." Diego opened his mouth to protest, but Raul cut him off with a raised hand. "No arguments. Let's go." Together, they closed up the cart, Raul carefully storing away any leftover empanadas and cleaning the surfaces. Diego moved slowly, his body clearly worn down, but he insisted on helping. Raul let him, knowing that sometimes what people needed most wasn't charity, but a chance to feel useful again. When they were done, Raul led the way to his small apartment a few blocks away. The apartment was modest: a cramped living room, a tiny kitchen, and a bedroom barely big enough for a bed and a nightstand. But it was warm, and it was home. "Make yourself comfortable," Raul said, pointing to the worn-out couch. Diego sank into it with a sigh that spoke of exhaustion and relief. Raul handed him a blanket. "Get some rest. We'll figure things out in the morning." Diego nodded, already half asleep. Raul watched for a moment before retreating to the kitchen to prepare some tea. He moved quietly, not wanting to disturb his guest. As he worked, he couldn't shake the image of Diego's gaunt face and weary eyes. Life had dealt him a cruel hand, but Raul was determined to help, even if just for a while. That night, Raul lay in his bed, listening to the sounds of the city outside: sirens, distant laughter, the hum of traffic. He thought of his own struggles, of the countless times he'd felt lost and hopeless. He had survived because of small acts of kindness from strangers. Now it was his turn to pay it forward. Morning came with the scent of coffee and the sound of rain tapping against the window. Raul prepared breakfast: simple eggs and bread, along with a fresh batch of empanadas. The smell roused Diego, who sat up slowly, wincing as he moved. "Good morning," Raul said, placing a plate on the small table. "Eat up." Diego's expression was a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "You don't have to do all this." Raul shrugged. "I want to." As they ate, Raul spoke. "I run the cart every day. You can stay here and rest, or come with me. Up to you." Diego considered for a moment before nodding. "I'll come with you." The day passed with the two of them working side by side. Diego helped wherever he could, handing out empanadas, cleaning up, chatting quietly with customers who noticed his shy smile. By the end of the day, Raul could see a spark of life returning to Diego's eyes. He was still tired, still thin, but there was a determination there that hadn't been before. Over the next few days, they settled into a routine. Diego worked with Raul at the cart, and Raul shared his small apartment, his meals, his stories. Each day, Diego seemed a little stronger, a little more himself. One evening, as they sat in the dimly lit apartment, Diego spoke of his past, of the job he'd lost, the people he'd let down, and the spiral that had led him to the streets. Raul listened quietly, offering no judgment, only understanding. They didn't know what the future would bring, but they knew they weren't alone. Kindness, Raul realized, wasn't just about a meal or a place to stay. It was about being seen, being valued, and having someone believe in you when you couldn't believe in yourself. And for now, that was enough. The rain continued to patter against the window in a steady rhythm, creating a soothing backdrop to the dim glow of the kitchen's single bulb. Raul and Diego sat at the small table, their plates now empty except for a few stray crumbs. Raul sipped his coffee slowly, while Diego stared at the steam rising from his own cup, lost in thought. The silence between them was comfortable, but Raul could sense there was something more Diego wanted to say. Eventually, Diego cleared his throat. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his voice hesitant. "About how I can keep helping out at the cart. I want to do more. I don't want to be a burden." Raul shook his head immediately. "You're not a burden," he said, his tone firm. "But if you want to do more, we can figure something out together." Diego nodded, a flicker of determination in his eyes. "I need to rebuild," he said quietly, piece by piece. Over the following days, Diego threw himself into the work. He arrived at the cart before Raul, ready to help with the morning prep, chopping onions, mixing spices, and carefully folding empanadas. His hands, though thin and calloused, moved with purpose. Raul watched with pride as Diego gradually found his footing. Together, they refined recipes, experimenting with new fillings that brought curious customers back for more. Word spread about the cart on 8th Street, the place where the empanadas were always fresh and the smiles were genuine. One day, as they served a particularly busy lunch crowd, a young mother with 2 children approached the cart. The children's eyes lit up when they saw the empanadas, but the mother hesitated, digging through her purse with a worried expression. Raul exchanged a glance with Diego, who nodded almost imperceptibly. It's on us today, Raul said, handing over 2 empanadas with a warm smile. The mother's eyes filled with gratitude, and Raul felt a pang in his chest. He knew what it was like to feel the weight of every purchase, every decision. As the mother walked away, Diego leaned in. "You did that for me," he said quietly, a hint of emotion in his voice. "It feels good to pay it forward." Raul nodded. "It's how we keep going." The days turned into weeks, and the routine of working the cart became something Diego cherished. He grew stronger, his face filling out and his eyes losing some of the haunted look they once held. But life wasn't without its challenges. One afternoon, as Raul was preparing dough, he felt a sharp pain in his chest. He clutched at it, his breath coming in short gasps. Diego noticed immediately, dropping everything to rush to his side. Diego's voice was panicked. "What's wrong?" I'm fine," Raul tried to say. But the pain didn't subside. Diego didn't hesitate. He flagged down a passerby, who called for an ambulance. Minutes later, Raul was being wheeled into the emergency room, Diego by his side, worry etched into every line of his face. The diagnosis was a wake-up call. Raul's heart was strained from years of hard work, stress, and neglecting his own health. The doctor's orders were clear. He needed to take it easy, to rest. But for Raul, rest meant not working, and not working meant no income. The weight of it all pressed down on him. But before he could sink into despair, Diego spoke up. "We'll make it work," he said, his voice steady. "I can run the cart." Raul looked at him, torn between pride and worry. "It's too much for you alone." "You've already done too much for me," Diego replied. "Let me do this. Let me give back." With Raul's reluctant agreement, they set a plan in motion. For the first few days, Raul stayed nearby, resting as he watched Diego manage the cart. Diego was careful and attentive, serving each customer with the same warmth Raul had taught him. There were mistakes, burnt empanadas, orders mixed up, but Diego refused to give up. Each night they worked together to improve, Raul offering advice from his spot on the couch, Diego absorbing every word like a sponge. Slowly, business picked up again. Regulars noticed Diego's dedication and began to ask about Raul's health, offering words of encouragement and small tips to help. The community that Raul had built through his kindness now rallied around them. Diego worked tirelessly, often waking up before dawn to prepare and staying late to clean. The work was grueling, but it gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. One evening, after a long day, Diego returned to the apartment to find Raul waiting with 2 steaming mugs of tea. They sat together in companionable silence, sipping and reflecting on how far they had come. "You know," Raul said eventually, a hint of a smile playing on his lips, "I think you might be better at this than I am." Diego laughed, a deep, genuine sound that seemed to lighten the entire room. "Never," he said. "You're the heart of it all." Raul's smile faded slightly, and he grew serious. "I'm proud of you, Diego. You've come a long way." Diego looked down at his mug, emotion swirling within him. "I wouldn't be here without you." Their moment was interrupted by a knock at the door. Raul frowned. Visitors were rare. Diego opened the door to find an older man standing there, his suit slightly rumpled but expensive enough to make him stand out. He introduced himself as Mr. Vargas and explained that he'd been hearing about a special empanada cart on 8th Street. Curiosity had brought him, and he wanted to know more. It turned out Mr. Vargas was a restaurant owner looking for new talent. Over the next few weeks, Diego and Raul met with Mr. Vargas, who proposed expanding their empanada business with his backing. It was an opportunity neither of them had imagined, but as excited as Diego was, he hesitated. "I don't want to leave you behind," he told Raul. Raul shook his head. "This is your chance, Diego. Take it." With Raul's blessing, Diego stepped into a new role, running a small shop with Raul's recipes at its heart. Raul continued to offer guidance, his health slowly improving with rest and less stress. The shop flourished, drawing in crowds who came for the empanadas and stayed for the story of resilience and kindness behind them. One day, As Diego worked behind the counter of their bustling shop, he saw a familiar figure in the crowd, a young man with tired eyes and worn clothes, standing just outside the door. Diego's heart ached with recognition. He grabbed an empanada, walked outside, and extended it with a kind smile. "Hungry?" he asked. The cycle of kindness continued, as it always would. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the busy empanada shop, a testament to the journey that Raul and Diego had shared. Customers filled the tables, their laughter and conversations mixing with the mouth-watering aroma of freshly baked empanadas. Diego worked the counter, his hands moving with practiced ease as he filled orders and greeted regulars. Each warm empanada he handed over was more than just food, it was a symbol of second chances, a reflection of how far he'd come. Raul sat at a table by the window, sipping tea and watching Diego with pride. His health had improved significantly since stepping back from the daily grind, and he now enjoyed the role of mentor and cheerleader. The shop had grown beyond anything they had imagined when Raul first handed Diego an empanada on that street corner. It was a place of warmth, resilience, and hope built on acts of kindness. The shop bustled, but Diego's focus remained sharp. He noticed every smile, every hungry glance, and every hesitant newcomer. Then, in the midst of the dinner rush, the door opened, and a man stepped in, a man who immediately stood out. He wore a tailored suit that fit him perfectly, and he moved with a confident grace that commanded attention. Diego paused, momentarily taken aback. The man's face seemed familiar, but he couldn't place it. The stranger approached the counter, his eyes scanning the shop with a look of quiet appreciation. When they met Diego's gaze, he smiled warmly. "You must be Diego," he said, his voice rich and steady. "Yes, sir." "Welcome," Diego replied, feeling a flicker of curiosity. "Can I get you an empanada?" The man nodded. "I'd like one of your best." Diego quickly prepared an empanada, taking extra care. He placed it on a small plate and handed it over. The man took a bite, closed his eyes, and let out a satisfied sigh. "This," he said, savoring the flavor, "is exceptional." Diego smiled, a mixture of pride and humility. "Thank you. We try to put our heart into everything we make." The man finished his empanada and reached into his jacket pocket. "I've been looking for this place," he said. "I heard about the empanadas, but more importantly, I heard about the story behind them." Diego's brow furrowed slightly. "The story?" The man nodded. "The street vendor who gave a hungry man food when he had nothing." A kindness that set off a chain reaction. He pulled out an envelope and handed it to Diego. "You see, that story reached me when I was at a turning point myself. It reminded me of what really matters." Diego opened the envelope and his breath caught. Inside were crisp bills totaling $1,000. His hands trembled. I can't accept this," he stammered, overwhelmed. "You already have," the man said with a gentle smile. "Consider it a thank you for keeping the cycle of kindness alive." Diego swallowed hard, nodding as emotions threatened to overwhelm him. The man gave him a parting nod and walked out of the shop, leaving behind stunned silence. Customers who had been nearby offered smiles and murmurs of encouragement, sensing that something special had just happened. When the moment passed, Diego turned to Raul, who was watching with wide eyes from his seat. Diego walked over, the envelope clutched tightly in his hand. He placed it in front of Raul. "This is for you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave me everything when I had nothing. You deserve this." Raul shook his head, tears glistening in his eyes. "Diego, I didn't help you for a reward." "I know," Diego said, his voice steady. "And that's why it's yours. Take it. Use it for whatever you need for yourself, for us, for the next person who needs a hand." Raul looked down at the envelope, then back up at Diego. Pride, gratitude, and love filled his gaze. "Thank you," he whispered, the words carrying all the weight of their shared journey. They embraced, two men bound not by blood but by something just as strong as shared belief in the power of compassion. Around them, the shop continued to buzz with life, but for a moment it felt like the world had narrowed to just them and the promise they'd made to always give back. As they pulled apart, Raul looked around at the shop, the people, the warmth, the hope. "Let's keep building," he said, his voice firm. "Together." Diego nodded. "Always." And so, they continued empanada by empanada, kindness by kindness, changing lives, one small act at a time. The cycle of giving continued, as it always would, in a place where hearts and hands worked as one.